At Christmas dinner, my sister opened the door, rolled her eyes, and said, "We don't want you here. Go ruin someone else's holiday." I looked inside and saw my whole family around the table, laughing. So I just nodded, turned around, and said, "Got it." 10 minutes later, she burst through the door, yelling my name when she found out I was going to fund her wedding. I, 32M, stood on my sister's doorstep that Christmas evening, holding a bottle of expensive wine and feeling like an idiot for showing up unannounced. The warm glow from inside her house painted golden rectangles across the snow, and I could hear the familiar sound of my family's laughter echoing through the walls. My sister opened the door, took one look at me, and rolled her eyes so dramatically I thought they might get stuck. She told me they didn't want me here and suggested I go ruin someone else's holiday instead. Through the doorway, I could see everyone around her dining table: Mom, Dad, my younger brother, his wife, even my aunt and uncle who lived 3 states away. They were all laughing at something, probably one of Dad's terrible jokes, completely oblivious to the fact that I was standing outside like some unwanted stranger. I just nodded, told her I got the message, and turned around. My footsteps crunched through the snow as I walked back to my car, that familiar ache in my chest spreading like spilled wine on white fabric. This wasn't the first time I'd been excluded from family gatherings, but it stung just as much as always. See, my family had this funny way of forgetting I existed whenever it was convenient. When my business started taking off 3 years ago, suddenly everyone remembered my phone number. When I was struggling to get it off the ground, working 80-hour weeks and eating ramen for dinner, radio silence. My sister especially had perfected the art of treating me like a walking ATM, friendly when she needed something, distant when she didn't. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the warm lights spill from their windows, and made a decision that would change everything. 10 minutes later, I was pulling into the parking lot of the nearby Starbucks, scrolling through my contacts. I found my sister's wedding planner. Yes, I had her number because I'd been secretly coordinating with her for months. My sister was getting married in 6 months, and the whole family knew money was tight for her and her fiancé. They'd been stressing about cutting costs, downgrading the venue, reducing the guest list. What they didn't know was that I'd been planning to surprise them with a check for $50,000 to cover everything they wanted but couldn't afford. The dream venue, the fancy flowers, the photographer they'd been gushing about but couldn't justify the expense for. I'd wanted to make their day perfect. I called the wedding planner and told her there'd been a change of plans. The anonymous benefactor who was going to fund the upgrades had decided to withdraw the offer. She sounded confused and asked if I was sure, mentioning how excited the bride had been when she'd heard about the mysterious donor. I confirmed that yes, the funding was officially off the table. Then I did something that felt both petty and satisfying. I called my sister's venue and canceled the upgrade they thought was mysteriously paid for. I contacted the florist and photographer and withdrew the deposits that had been placed by an anonymous client. Within 20 minutes, I'd systematically dismantled the dream wedding I'd been secretly orchestrating. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. The first call was from the wedding planner, frantically trying to reach my sister. Then the venue coordinator, confused about the cancellation. The florist wanted confirmation about the withdrawal. My sister's phone must have been lighting up like a Christmas tree. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through downtown where all the Christmas displays were still twinkling. Part of me felt guilty, but a larger part felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to my family: power. For once, I wasn't the one left out in the cold. My apartment was quiet and warm when I got back. I poured myself a glass of the wine I'd brought for dinner and settled into my chair by the window. The city looked peaceful under its blanket of snow, and I felt oddly calm considering what I'd just done. The hammering on my door started exactly 10 minutes after I'd gotten home. I could hear my sister shouting my name through the wooden door, her voice cracking with panic. I took another sip of wine before getting up to answer it. When I opened the door, she practically fell into my apartment, her face red from cold and crying, still wearing the same green sweater she'd had on when she dismissed me from her doorstep. She immediately started crying and asking what I'd done, why the wedding vendors were calling her about cancellations. The words tumbled out of her between sobs, something about an anonymous donor, upgrades being withdrawn, deposits being refunded. She grabbed my arm and demanded to know if I knew anything about it. I looked at her for a long moment. This sister who'd shut me out of Christmas dinner without a second thought. now standing in my living room desperate for my help. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about and asked if she'd like some wine. Her face went pale. She asked me again if I was sure I didn't know anything about a donor for her wedding. I confirmed that I didn't know what she meant and mentioned that it was interesting how she'd managed to find time to visit me tonight, when just an hour ago, she'd told me to go ruin someone else's holiday. That's when the real crying started. She collapsed onto my couch and told me everything. How she and her fiancé had been planning a small wedding because of money, how they'd gotten calls about mysterious upgrades being paid for by someone who wanted to remain anonymous, how she'd been so excited about finally having the wedding she'd dreamed of. Now it was all falling apart, and she didn't know what to do. I sat down across from her and asked why she thought I might know anything about it. She looked up at me with mascara streaked down her cheeks and said she didn't know. She was just scared and calling everyone she could think of. I told her that was interesting, considering I apparently wasn't someone she thought to invite to Christmas dinner. The silence that followed was deafening. She stared at me, and I could see the pieces clicking together in her mind. Her expression changed from desperate to suspicious to horrified. She asked me directly if I was the anonymous donor. I smiled and told her I'd already said I didn't know what she was talking about. But she wasn't stupid. She asked why I was really at her house tonight, why I'd shown up unannounced when we barely talked anymore. I explained that I'd thought it might be nice to spend Christmas with my family, but I'd clearly been mistaken about being welcome. She started apologizing then, saying she'd been having a stressful day with all the wedding planning, that she hadn't meant to be so harsh. She insisted that of course I was welcome, that it had just been a misunderstanding. I asked her if she was only saying that because she thought I might be able to help with her wedding. The look on her face was answer enough. I stood up and walked to my desk, pulling out a folder I'd prepared months ago. Inside were contracts with vendors, receipts for deposits, correspondence with the wedding planner. I handed it to her without saying a word. She opened it, and her hands started shaking as she realized what she was looking at. $50,000 worth of wedding arrangements, all paid for by me, all recently canceled. The anonymous donor hadn't been some fairy godmother or wealthy family friend. It had been her brother, the one she'd just told to go ruin someone else's holiday. She looked up at me and whispered that she didn't understand why I'd done this. I sat back down and explained that I'd wanted to give her the wedding of her dreams because despite everything, she was still my sister. But sitting in that car tonight, watching my entire family celebrate Christmas without me, I'd realized something important. I'd been trying to buy love from people who only valued me for what I could provide. She started crying again and said she was sorry, that she'd made a mistake, that we could fix this. She promised things would be different and begged me to reconsider. I told her I'd already made my decision. Update 1. The next few days were chaos. My phone rang constantly with calls from family members who'd apparently heard about the wedding situation. Mom called crying, asking how I could do this to my sister during the holidays. Dad left voicemails about family loyalty and forgiveness. My brother sent angry texts about me being petty and vindictive. What struck me was that none of them had called to apologize for Christmas dinner. None of them acknowledged that I'd been excluded or asked why I might be upset. They only cared now that my sister's wedding was in jeopardy. My sister showed up at my apartment twice more that week. The first time, she brought our parents as backup, thinking maybe they could convince me to change my mind. She'd told them I was the anonymous donor, and they spent an hour in my living room trying to guilt me into reinstating the funding. Mom kept saying she didn't understand why I was being so cruel, that this wasn't like me. Dad mentioned that family was supposed to support each other through thick and thin. I pointed out that support seemed to be a one-way street in our family, and asked them where this concern for family support had been at Christmas dinner. The silence was telling. Mom tried to explain that the Christmas thing had been a misunderstanding, that my sister had been overwhelmed with wedding stress. I asked her why no one had called to check on me after I left, why no one had wondered if I was okay spending Christmas alone. Dad said they'd assumed I'd made other plans. I laughed and asked when I'd ever made other plans that didn't include them. When had I ever chosen to spend holidays elsewhere? The answer was never, because they were my only family, and despite how they treated me, I kept showing up hoping things would be different. They left that night without changing my mind. The second visit was just my sister, and she tried a different approach. She apologized for Christmas, said she'd been wrong to turn me away. She acknowledged that I'd always been there for the family and admitted she'd taken me for granted. She promised that if I helped with the wedding, She'd make sure I was included in everything going forward. I asked her what would happen after the wedding was over and the thank you cards were sent. Would she go back to forgetting I existed until she needed something else? She swore she wouldn't, but we both knew the pattern too well. I told her I believed she was sorry, but sorry didn't erase years of being treated like a convenient bank account. The wedding funding was gone, but more importantly, so was my willingness to keep accepting scraps of affection from people who should love me unconditionally. She left crying, and I felt oddly peaceful. Update 2. 2 weeks into January, I got an unexpected call from my aunt, the one who'd been at Christmas dinner but hadn't said a word when I was turned away at the door. She wanted to meet for coffee, said she had some things she needed to say. I almost declined, but curiosity got the better of me. We met at a small cafe downtown, and she surprised me by apologizing immediately. She said she'd been thinking about Christmas night for weeks and felt terrible about staying silent when my sister dismissed me. She'd wanted to say something, to invite me in herself, but she'd been caught off guard and hadn't known how to handle the family politics. I appreciated the apology, but I told her that staying silent was a choice too. She nodded and said she knew that now. Then she told me something that changed my entire perspective on the situation. She explained that my sister had been complaining about me all evening at Christmas dinner. She'd been telling everyone how I thought I was too good for the family now that my business was successful, how I'd gotten arrogant and distant. She'd painted a picture of me as someone who looked down on them, who only showed up when it was convenient for me. My aunt said she'd been confused by these descriptions because they didn't match the person she knew, but she'd stayed quiet because family dinners weren't the place for confrontation. I stared at my coffee, processing this information. My sister hadn't just excluded me from dinner. She'd been actively poisoning the family against me for months. She'd created a narrative where I was the villain, the ungrateful brother who'd abandoned his family for success. My aunt continued, explaining that when my sister's wedding crisis hit and the family learned I'd been the mysterious donor all along, it had forced them to confront the disconnect between the story they'd been told and the reality of my actions. A selfish, arrogant brother doesn't secretly fund his sister's dream wedding. A person who thinks he's too good for his family doesn't spend months coordinating with vendors to create the perfect celebration. She said my parents were starting to realize they'd been getting a very one-sided version of events, but they were too proud and embarrassed to admit they'd been wrong. I thanked her for the honesty and asked what she thought I should do. She smiled sadly and said that was up to me, but maybe it was time to stop trying to convince people of my worth and start surrounding myself with people who already saw it. Update 3. It's been 3 months since Christmas, and I've made some significant changes in my life. I stopped taking calls from family members who only reached out when they needed something. I started saying no to requests for money, favors, and emotional labor that were never reciprocated. Most importantly, I began building relationships with people who actually valued my presence, not just my presence. I joined a hiking group and made friends who invited me to things because they enjoyed my company. I started dating someone who was genuinely interested in getting to know me as a person. I volunteered at a local nonprofit and found meaning in work that mattered to people who appreciated the effort. My sister's wedding happened in March, but it was a much smaller affair than originally planned. They managed to pull together something nice within their actual budget, and from what I heard through the grapevine, it was a lovely day. I wasn't invited, which was exactly what I'd expected. My parents sent me photos anyway, along with a message about how beautiful everything was and how much they wished I'd been there. I looked at the pictures, my sister looking radiant in a simple dress, my family smiling and dancing, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years when thinking about them. Nothing. No anger, no hurt, no longing to be included. Just a calm detachment, like looking at photos of strangers having a nice time. That's when I knew I'd finally moved on. The final surprise came last week when I received a handwritten letter from my sister. Not a text or email, but an actual letter in my mailbox. She wrote that she'd had a lot of time to think since Christmas, especially during the wedding planning process, when she had to face the reality of what she'd lost. She admitted that she'd been jealous of my success and had convinced herself that I looked down on the family to make herself feel better about her own struggles. She acknowledged that she'd painted me as the villain in stories she told others, and she was ashamed of how she'd treated someone who'd only ever tried to love and support her. She didn't ask for anything, no money, no forgiveness, no reconciliation. She just wanted me to know that she understood what she'd lost and that she was sorry. I read the letter twice, then filed it away. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Some trust, once shattered, can't be repaired. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to stop trying to force relationships with people who've made it clear that your value to them is conditional. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not hurt. I'm just free. And that feels like the best revenge of all. 6 months ago, I was standing on a doorstep in the snow, desperate to belong somewhere I was never truly wanted. Today, I'm sitting in my apartment, surrounded by photos and mementos from adventures with people who choose to include me in their lives, not because they have to or because they need something, but because they genuinely want me there. I learned that you can't buy love, but more importantly, I learned that you shouldn't have to. Sometimes the best gift you can give yourself is the permission to walk away from people who don't appreciate what you bring to their lives. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop fighting for a place at a table where you're not welcome. And sometimes, revenge isn't about hurting the people who hurt you. It's about building a life so good that their approval becomes irrelevant. I found my family. They just weren't the people I'd expected them to be.